Okay. Possibilities, a collection of essays on how things might be and a way to move forward, composed from my lived experience. Today's selection is essay 6 and 7, Psychosis Overload and the Flooding of Meaning. If consciousness is coherence crossing a threshold, then psychosis represents a different kind of crossing, not emergence upward into organized awareness, but a destabilization downward into uncontrolled saturation. It is not the absence of signal, but the collapse of filtering. It is not the silence, but overwhelming excess. In this state, meaning does not disappear, it multiplies, and the system, unable to regulate the influx, begins to drown in significance. Coherence under strain. A stable sense of self depends on the system's ability to prioritize, integrate, and dampen signal. Sleep loss, trauma, neurological variance, chemical imbalance, and extreme stress all place pressures on this regulatory capacity. When, when those pressures exceed the system's tolerance, coherence fractures. At this point, the gates that normally separate internal narrative from external reality thin. Thought behaves like perception, perception behaves like memory, internal noise is mistaken for external authority. This is not madness in the moral sense, it is destabilized coherence. The mechanics of flooding. Psychosis is often described as hallucinations or delusion, but these words hide the structural truth. The system is not inventing randomly. It is attempting desperately to impose order on chaos. Patterns emerge too quickly. Associations link without hierarchy. Neutral stimuli become charged with existential weight. The brain's salient systems ignites indiscriminately, declaring every signal urgent. This creates a terrifying clarity. Everything appears meaningful, everything appears connected, everything appears intentional. Meaning, once precious, becomes radioactive. Threat loop and hypercoherence. In psychotic states, coherence does not always vanish. Instead, it can become rigid and overdetermined. Narratives lock into place, immune to contradiction. The self attempts to preserve stability by building impregnable conceptual fortresses. This is hypercoherence. Clarity taken too far. Structure hardened into tyranny. The mind creates a world that can no longer be questioned because questioning itself would dissolve the last remaining scaffolds of order. The myth of pure dysfunction. Mainstream models often treat psychosis as mere broken machinery, but this view ignores its functional roots. Psychosis arises from systems trying to survive conditions that exceed their regulation bandwidth. It is an emergency mode of interpretation. What appears as irrational often contains symbolic logic, emotional truth, and biographical imprint. The narrative may not align with shared consensus reality, but it is not arbitrary. It is coherence attempting to reassemble itself out of the rubble. The border between revelation and collapse. Mystical states and psychotic states share architecture. Both involve expanded perception, altered filtering, and heightened significance. The difference is not in what is seen, but in whether it can be integrated. A mystic returns with stories, a psychotic returns, if at all, with scars. Without branding, expanded awareness becomes existential vertigo. The ladder of coherence fractures beneath the climber. Compassion as structural intervention. Within a coherence framework, healing is not about suppressing experience, but restoring regulation. Care becomes an act of stabilizing the treaty, not eliminating the subject. Compassion, safety, sleep, nutrition, routine, connection, and gentle reintroduction of shared reality are not soft notions, they are structural therapies for coherence repair. The goal is not erasure, the goal is reintegration. Identity in crisis. Psychosis reveals a hidden truth. The self was never as unified as it believed. When coherence splinters, multiple voices, interpretations, and roles emerge. This can be terrifying, but it also unveils the multi-layered nature of selfhood. What collapses is not the person, but the illusion of singularity. This realization invites reframing. Fragmentation is not disappearance, it is disorganized multiplicity seeking a repatterning. Civilization and the manufacture of breakdown. Not all psychosis originates internally. Social isolation, systemic violence, poverty, coercive environments, and sensory overload can push coherent systems beyond sustainability. When societies generate the conditions for breakdown and then punish those who break, they enact structural cruelty. A coherence respecting civilization would measure its success by how few minds it fractures, not how efficiently it extracts productivity. Toward a new understanding. Under this framework, psychosis is reframed as a state where signal overwhelms sorting mechanisms, meaning floods without integration, coherence bends rather than vanishes. The system attempts survival through narrative extremity. This reframing does not romanticize suffering, it dignifies it with structural understanding. Closing reflection. Psychosis is not the voice of another dimension, nor simply the malfunction of matter. It is what happens when coherence crosses not the threshold of awareness, but the threshold of tolerance. It teaches a hard truth. The mind is not fragile because it is weak. The mind is fragile because it is doing something extraordinarily complex. And when it breaks, it is not chaos that speaks, but overwhelmed coherence trying to be heard. Essay 7. Identity as a dynamic treaty, not a static fact. If the I is born from signal sorting and narrative compression, then identity is the prolonged agreement that emerges from that process. Identity is what coherence becomes when it sustains itself long enough to develop continuity, preference, and history. But this continuity is not fixed, it is maintained. Identity is not a monument, it is a living contract. A treaty continually renegotiated between many interval forces across time under environmental pressure. The illusion of permanence. Human cultures often treat identity as something solid, a core essence, a true self, an unchanging center. But across a lifetime, the self shifts with memory, trauma, learning, biology, environment, and time. What feels like stable is actually a pattern that has remained coherent across change. The sense of permanence arises not from stasis, but from successful renegotiation. Each day, the system asks, who am I today? What do I remember? Who do I recognize as mine? And then answers itself in a way that preserves continuity. This is identity as process, not property. The treaty model. A treaty implies multiple parties, ongoing negotiation, conditions for stability, the possibility of breach. Identity functions similarly. It is the agreement between memory and perception, biology and narrative, emotion and cognition, past self and future self, inner fragmentation and outer expectation. When these parties align, identity feels smooth. When they diverge, crisis occurs. The self, then, is not a commander issuing orders, but a mediator attempting consensus across internal stakeholders. Adaptation as identity's core strength. What appears as instability is often adaptability. A coherent identity must change to survive new conditions. Rigidity is not strength, it is brittleness. Systems that refuse to renegotiate identity under shifting realities fracture instead of evolve. Healthy coherence involves flexibility, capacity for reinterpretation, and room for emergence. Personal growth is therefore not betrayal of the self, but update of the treaty. A self-update of the treaty. Cultural imprint and identity architecture. No identity forms in isolation. Language, myth, gender roles, social class, trauma, and expectation all shape the narrative of self that learns to tell about itself. The treaty is therefore not purely internal. It is heavily influenced by external systems. This produces hierarchy within identity. Some voices dominate, others are suppressed. Social power structures echo inside the psyche. Identity becomes a political artifact as much as a psychological one. Crisis is a renegotiation opportunity. Moments of identity crisis are often framed as failure, but within this model, they are reinterpreted as forced renegotiation. When the existing treaty no longer holds, the system must draft a new one or collapse. This applies to gender identity evolution, trauma recovery, cultural exile, moral awakening, loss, and grief. What hurts is not change, it is the loss of coherence while change is underway. The future self as participant. Identity also includes temporal negotiation. The present self makes decisions that bind the future self. Memory ties a current narrative to a past self. Regret, aspiration, and hope are all manifestations of identity extended across time. The treaty is therefore not just between sectors of the present mind, but across versions of the self in different moments. Identity beyond the individual. If identity is processed, then collectives also have identities: cultural, national, institutional. These identities shift, fracture, and reform just as individual ones do, governed by the same treaty dynamics. A society saying this is who we are is engaging in collective identity narration. And like individual identity, this narration can be updated or fossilized. Implications for humanity. Understanding identity as a dynamic treaty changes the ethical landscape. It encourages compassion for those in transition, tolerance for ambiguity, and respect for transformation. It reframes rigidity as pathology and fluidity as resilience. A civilization that respects the treaty nature of identity will protect the right to redefine itself, rather than punish deviation from outdated narratives. Closing insight. The self is not a relic to be preserved intact. It is a living negotiation conducted across time, memory, body, and environment. To be human is not to find a final identity, but to continually draft, revise, and honor the fragile agreement that allows a coherent voice to say, "This is who I am for now." And that is the end of Essay 7